All right, everybody. Sorry that I've been absent there. I think I sent you an email kind of explaining my situation, and kind of really meant to originally to give you all a little break, um, and then some those personal things happened, and got away from what I needed to be doing here. But we're not really that far behind, and I will be. You only have one more test, and I'll give you another assignment, and also probably an extra point assignment as well. So we're going to talk a little bit today is about the 1920s. Um, this is a picture of Woodrow Wilson, who you should be familiar with to some extent. Remember, he was the president during World War One. The United States was involved in World War One from 1917 to 1918. The United States lost about 120,000 military personnel there. When I say there, I'm talking about Europe. And we talked in some previous lectures about the Treaty of Versailles. And make sure that you study that. Woodrow Wilson was the president from 1913 to 1921. And sometimes, of course, these things get a little confusing with the dates because he was elected in 1912. Remember, today we have elections. There'll be an election in November for the presidency. So every 4 years, the presidential election is in November, but one does not get inaugurated until the next year. All right, which now is January 20th. Before, I think originally it may have been in April, and then it was moved to March, and now it's in January. I'm not sure in the 1920s if it had been January 20th. I think it was, but I'm not sure. But anyway, so as long as you know this, and then of course, um, Harding, who I'll talk about in a second, was elected in 20 and became president in 1921. Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat. But some policies that we've seen in the United States recently is sometimes considered very Wilsonian, because Wilson believed in this idea of making the world safe for democracy. That's something that he was famous for, and we heard George W. Bush, who was actually a who or is a Republican. But was some of his foreign policies was considered Wilsonian, because going to war in Iraq, a big part of that was in the hopes that democracy would somehow spread around the Middle East. And this was what was called a neo conservative foreign policy, and it's called neoconservative because it did have some ideological relations to Wilson's ideas. It's just something to kind of keep in mind that oftentimes we divide things according to the Democrats and Republicans, but it doesn't always work that way. So Wilson is probably best known, of course, obviously for a lot of his foreign policy. He was very much an idealist. He was, the president during World War One, and obviously there's much more to the man, but we have to move on. Now this fella here kind of looks like some like a mean old uncle or something. Guy by the name of Warren G. Harding. He was president from 1921 to 1923. He died in 23, probably of a heart attack. He just collapsed and died. He was a Republican and is very pro-business, and did a lot in order to kind of chip away at certain regulations. And this is something that you see throughout American history. Don't think that that's anything that's new today. There are people such as Harding that believed more strongly in this idea of laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire economics, which means leave it alone, let it alone. The fewer regulations, the better for business. And if you have more business, then you can get more tax revenue without raising taxes. And people that make more money, they invest that money, which creates jobs. Okay, so some people say that's what's known as kind of like supply side economics, and that it's totally ridiculous. Other people believe in it very strongly. And what do I believe? Well, that's not really my job to tell you what I believe. You have to decide that on your own. But a lot of these things, like a lot of other things, there's some truth to it, a lot of truth to it. It works sometimes, but then there may be some problems as well. So what I think is people tend to be at extremes nowadays, and a lot of what we need is probably right here in the middle. But I just gave you my opinion after telling you I wasn't going to give you my opinion. But anyway, let's move on. So this guy named Calvin Coolidge was president from 1923. He was the vice president under Harding to 1929. As I said, 28 is when his successor, Herbert Hoover, would take over. Coolidge is kind of considered a pretty good guy, pretty good president in the sense that I didn't tell you this, but Harding there was a lot of controversy and some shenanigans that went on in his administration, and Coolidge kind of calmed things down. Is kind of considered someone that was able to govern without a whole lot of scandal. But he also was very pro-business and anti-regulation. And as I said, this is sometimes called, supply side economics. And was a believer in laissez-faire economics. And I know I repeat things sometimes. It's not because I'm getting senile. It's simply because I like to, it's a pedagogical technique. The more I repeat it, hopefully you'll remember it. And so Coolidge, as I said, was kind of continued in throughout the 1920s. That's what I want you to remember. This was a period in which regulation was slashed, and kind of what I said earlier, regulation, it's really difficult sometimes to find that balance. I think there probably needs to be some regulation, but it is true that if you have too much regulation, then it can stifle the economy. And so a lot of political debate and people calling each other ignorant and stupid, it's really just trying to find that balance. That's all it is. Everybody just needs to chill sometimes. You know what I'm saying? All right. Now, this guy here, Herbert Hoover, gets a really bad rap because he was president when the stock market crashed, which we'll talk about in a second, and when the Great Depression began. Now, why do I say he gets a bad rap? Was he responsible? No, I mean, you can't blame it on one man. This is something that happened, started, who knows when. I mean, I'm not going to get into where it all started because that brings up, people don't agree on that. But it wasn't just due to Herbert Hoover. Some people say that he should have done a lot more once the stock market crashed, but nonetheless, that's a matter of debate. Hoover was president from 1928. Again, I should say 29 is when he was inaugurated, until 1932. He was not reelected. In fact, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, sometimes known as FDR, was elected, and we'll talk about him later. Now, what was up with the stock market crash? Now, I am not an economist, although I did make A's in economics when I was in college, an undergraduate at UL. But the only reason I made A's was because I had a big crush on this girl in the class, and I wanted to impress her, but unfortunately it didn't work. Okay, so What was up with the stock market crash? And I'll end this lecture with the stock market crash. Well, you could say that throughout the 1920s, everyone was sort of engaged in this crazy speculation or gambling in stocks. Okay, not only banks and businesses, but just poor, almost poor people too, like teachers at Sowella. Okay. Now, some people even quit their jobs to get rich, just like gamblers do, and this is always a bad idea, or as maybe some of your great-grandparents might say, pas bon. That means not good. The stock speculation was further increased by the willingness of brokers to lend investors the money to purchase stocks from them. And I just kind of want to explain some of this. You don't have to remember all of this. But between June of 1927 and September of 1929, brokers' loans doubled as frenzied investors rushed into the market, which just kept going up, 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 up. And there were some people that thought that it would never go down. So if you bought a stock here, it was almost like a guarantee that you could make money here. And this is something that happened to housing a few years ago, where like everybody was just buying a house and then selling a house a few months later, and they would make a profit. Now this is what you call over speculation, and it works for some people, but then eventually it catches up. And that's what almost plunged us into a Great Depression, but it seemed like we got off with a recession, which is a milder form of depression. For some people, for some demographics, however, it was a depression. Anyway, all of this speculation in the stock market drove stock prices far beyond their real value. And again, that's when I use the example of housing, and that's kind of what happened. So people would buy a house for $1 million, but the house was really worth $500,000. And when this person maybe lost their job or whatever, and they couldn't sell the house, they were in a bind. So that's kind of an example of over speculation. The pin, which would pop the balloon, and this is something that when people are over speculating like this, they sometimes call it a balloon, was the Bank of England's raising of its interest rates. The slide in stock prices began October 23rd, 1928. Or I should say 29, I'm sorry. It was stabilized a little bit by J.P. Morgan's purchase of large numbers of shares, and President Hoover did express confidence. So things seemed like they were going to get a little bit better. But October 29th, which is known as Black Tuesday, everything crashed. Woo! By the end of October, stocks had lost 37% of their value. It's approximately $40 billion, more than the total cost of World War I. The savings of millions of Americans were wiped out in a matter of days. Even Americans who had stayed out of the stock market were suddenly panic-stricken, and a lot of them ran to the banks, and the banks closed, so they couldn't get their money. Businesses had increased consumer debt by offering installment plans for the purchase of new appliances. The panic-stricken people rushed to the then uninsured banks and withdrew their money, causing even healthy banks to collapse. The failure of over 9,000 banks wiped out the life savings of a lot of people who were trying to withdraw their money. And the collapse of both the stock market and the banking system destroyed consumer confidence. People refused to buy goods, businesses went bankrupt, caused massive unemployment, which further damaged consumer confidence and reduced consumption. And many failing banks called in farm loans, leading to foreclosures and further unemployment. And the term vicious cycle was especially descriptive of this situation. And the stock market crash of 1929 both foreshadowed and helped cause the worst economic depression in world history. This is called the Great Depression. So I kind of went over that fast. I'm not going to ask you a lot of questions. I do kind of want you to look up Black Tuesday and do a little research maybe on your own on the stock market crash. But you don't have to memorize all that I just said. So don't worry about that. Okay. How long did the Great Depression last? Well, we'll talk about that later.